Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining
Oh,
our webinar. So today we're talking about why do we call body focus process addictions, or BFPAs, addictions? And myself and my colleague Shelley DeFaria and I are going to present this. And feel free to post in the chat as we go along. We'll be answering questions as we go along and also at the end. And also today we are recording this, so if you want to not show your video, that's cool. And if you do, that's cool too. But just to let you know, we are recording this.
okay. So we're here to talk about body focused process addictions and why we call them an addiction. So first we will begin by defining how we define BFPAs. Um, and we've turned it into a bit of a mathematical equation. BFPAs equaling BFRBs plus addiction science equal BFRBs plus addiction science equals BFPAs, body focused process addictions. Process addictions are also called behavioral addictions.
Right. And so I think that's really important to know because when we say body focused process addiction, a lot of people don't know what that means yet. And that's part of our process here is to educate people on what that means. So process addictions and behavioral addictions are interchangeable. So what's a process or behavioral addiction? So one of the easy ways to sort of define this is it's when we become hooked a um, on a behavior and the process of doing that behavior for the temporary relief it brings. So let me just say that again. It's when we become hooked on a behavior and the process of doing that behavior for the temporary relief it brings. Process addictions are not substance addictions, and that's another important distinction is that substance addictions are to alcohol, drugs, etc. And process addictions are not the same, even though they're all addictions. Um, and there can be some overlap, but basically we're going to separate out substance addictions from process addictions. So generally we think of process addictions including things like gambling, working, exercising, a need for control, hair pulling, skin picking, nail biting. All of these things are behaviors that can become addictive. And we're going to talk more today about why these things become addictive and when they cross that line into becoming an addiction.
So process addictions, like all addictions, start with a trigger. And the cycle looks like the diagram you're looking at. It's the trigger, the behavior, followed by relief, then followed by a crash. And then the cycle begins again. You're triggered, you engage in the behavior, you get the relief that you were hoping for, and then you crash. So it's that cycle we all know so well as pullers and pickers and people who deal with these process addictions. So, okay,
So sorry, didn't want
that's
to.
all right. No, you're good. Going on to the next slide.
No,
Unless you wanted to add to this for me.
yeah, no, I just wanted to add here that so the relief can also be thought of, and it's important to think of as a reward. And we're going to talk a little bit more
Mhm.
about this later. So I love this cycle, the trigger behavior relief crash. And just to point out that sometimes, you might have a different label. So you might have a different label for the trigger or the behavior. The relief, for sure, I think it's important to point out that it isn't always a sense of relief, but it's some sort of reward. And that
Mm.
reward can be a sense of accomplishment or detaching from the present moment. It is a reward. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. So I just wanted to point that out right now that it's not always relief. And then crash, again, I think this is an awesome model. And also, crash may be not so much of a crash, but just kind of like a flat line or a period of time between the reward and the next time the person is triggered.
Would you also say, Karen, that the relief kind of alludes to a chemical release, like a dopamine high and then a crash?
Absolutely. And so, there's a lot of neurochemicals that go on in this entire cycle, and dopamine is actually part of this entire cycle up until the crash phase. The
Mhm.
dopamine is kind of out of the picture. But the trigger behavior and relief or reward parts of the cycle
Right.
absolutely involve dopamine and other neurotransmitters.
Mm. So why we shouldn't fear the word addiction? Let's jump into this.
Yeah, because I think that one of the things that we've heard as we've rolled out our model of body focused process addictions is, oh, why are you calling this an addiction? I thought addiction was just about drugs and substances. And I believe that, just based on what we've noticed, is some people don't want to own that these conditions are addictions, and addiction does have a negative stigma in general around it, although that is changing, and we hope to be part of that change. But why we shouldn't fear the word addiction. So, addiction is not a moral failure. It's a pattern often rooted in stress, trauma, or unmet needs, not a character flaw. And I think traditionally, when we look at media and movies and TV shows and just the sort of general uh, thoughts about addiction that occur in our culture, which are changing, but haven't changed completely, is that, oh, if you're like, especially drugs and alcohol, like, oh, there's something wrong with you if you can't get a hold of yourself and not stop drinking or using drugs. But actually, addiction is a disease, and substance use is a disease. And the conditions that we're talking about with body focused process addictions are also not moral failures. They're conditions that have a neurochemical component, and they're not a character flaw. It's not about somebody not having willpower or control. It's
Mm.
something that gets built up over time, and then, as we'll talk about in a minute, again, it's a pattern that develops. So one of the things that we're doing is really hoping to destigmatize these conditions.
Mhm. And addiction doesn't mean you're broken. It means your brain found a coping strategy that became automatic. And that's where the process addiction becoming an automatic um, strategy, is comes into play.
Right. And it becomes a self-soothing, it's a coping strategy. So it often is based in a desire to self-soothe.
Hmm.
And again, it once it becomes a once it becomes a coping strategy or a self-soothing strategy, then the neural pathways that get developed um, become stronger and stronger. And then the strategy becomes more automatic. It becomes a go-to for coping with uncomfortable or unpleasant emotional and physical states, including boredom,
Mm.
overstimulation, anxiety, depression. So both what we think of as the ups and the downs. Uh, Body focused process addictions become a coping strategy for those uncomfortable and hard to sit through states. So we believe that naming it helps, not harms. The word addiction gives us a language to understand what's happening instead of blaming ourselves. So again, this goes back to the fact that these behaviors are an addiction and they are a disease. They are based in neuroprogramming and neurochemicals and neural pathways. And so we are very intent on making sure that people come to realize that it's not about blaming yourself that you do these behaviors. So again, to go back to the sort of traditional way of thinking about addiction in terms of drinking or drug abuse, again, some people look at those as saying, well, that person just doesn't have self-control or willpower. But that's actually not true. Substance use disorders are now classified as a disease. And they are a disease because the amount of distress and suffering that is caused in a person's life is not intentional. It becomes a habit. It becomes, like we said earlier, a go-to, a way to cope with situations in life. And who can blame any of us for doing what, quote unquote, works for us in the moment to deal with anything that we are facing in our lives?
Addiction exists on a spectrum. So not all addictions look like substance abuse, much to what Karen was just sharing. Um, some are based some are a process-based addiction, like skin picking, hair pulling, nail biting, screen use, and overuse, or other compulsive behaviors. So the process addictions, I find that it's been very eye-opening to really see the wide range that process addictions actually cross over and spread around because social media being a really big one for a lot of people these days, and gambling, and you can even look at certain types of eating as a process addiction, not necessarily a severe eating disorder. So there's a wide spectrum where process addictions live.
Right. And I think that, clinically, historically, clinically, we look at whether or not a condition or behavior is causing someone what's referred to as clinically significant distress.
Hmm.
And so, what might be an addiction for one person may not be an addiction for another person. And let me just clarify what that means. So, again, the clinical definition is whether or not it causes significant distress. So if the behavior or the addiction, the process addiction, is causing significant distress or interruption in a person's life in terms of work, relationships, hobbies, overall well-being, then once it starts to negatively impact any area of a person's life, it can be considered, an addiction. And again, because we're all different, then uh, that sort of marker of when does it cross over into becoming an addiction does occur on a spectrum because it's very individual. When does what I'm doing become problematic in other areas of my life, or even problematic to me in terms of how I'm feeling about what I'm doing. So emotional distress is also part of that. So that's why we talk about all psychological conditions, but also process addictions, as we're talking about today, that they occur on a spectrum. So for some people, a certain amount of skin picking may not be a problem.
Mhm.
But for other people, that same, quote, amount of skin picking might be a problem because it's leading to avoiding or hiding or shame or other kinds of things that are negatively impacting a person's life.
Well said.
So, why are addictions so powerful? And the answer to that really lies, simply stated, in that all addictions involve a neurochemical called dopamine. So, I think we've all heard about dopamine hits. And dopamine is a powerful force in shaping and maintaining behaviors that feel good or produce a reward of some kind. And so this is why Shelley and I are so committed to and believe so much in this model is because dopamine is absolutely involved in body focused process addictions. It's a dopamine hit, at least originally, when a person starts engaging in these behaviors. Over time, because of the um, sort of getting used to a certain amount of dopamine and the fact that the dopamine and the receptors in the brain get used to being stimulated by a behavior and therefore don't respond in the same positive way over time. So it's like the behavior, you keep on going because you want that
More.
more because you're still seeking that original reward, which made such a strong impression on you about how powerful and rewarding it was to feel what you felt. But over time, that feeling and that intensity can diminish, but the desire to engage in the behavior remains because there is still a dopamine, sort of like, a dopamine, how like they have those Ozempic things that are like constantly feeding you.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
you
like,
can see how it crosses over and is so parallel to social media, TikTok, swiping, right? It's just and you were on there for an hour yesterday, and now you're on there for an hour and 10 minutes tomorrow, and then it just keeps getting, to an 8 hour day. Um, it's you can see the parallel, it's the spectrum again
yeah,
of the behavior needing more to be fed more dopamine. And then we all know after 8 hours of that or 4 hours of that, it's the crash.
exactly. But we keep going back to seek
See
that
it. Mm-hmm.
dopamine hit. And
Mm-hmm.
and that's why, sort of taking what's body focused repetitive behaviors and adding the addiction science to equal body focused process addictions to us is so important because this component of the dopamine in the addiction cycle has not been part of treatment up until we developed this model.
So addictions are rewarding and that they activate the reward circuitry in the brain, as we were just sharing. Addictions are both positively and negatively reinforcing. Both of these reinforcements increase the probability that the addictive behavior will continue.
Right. And so what do we mean by positively and then also negatively reinforcing? So positively reinforcing means, okay, yes, I'm getting this reward, and so I'm going to keep engaging in this behavior so that I can continue to receive this reward. So that's a positive reinforcement. The negative reinforcement is, oh, I engaged in this behavior again, and I didn't feel that same level of reward as I did initially. So I'm going to keep going until I feel I'm either exhausted, which is what usually happens, or I feel that I've gotten enough of a reward so that I will continue.
So you're
Um,
chasing the reward.
yeah, you're chasing, and all of that time and energy spent chasing the reward is a negative reinforcement saying, oh, wait, I have to spend all this much more time trying to get this reward. But because of the neural programming and the dopamine hit, it's like, yeah, but I know it's out there. I just got to keep going. And when you think of a heroin addict, for instance, like it's never enough. I'll do anything. I'll sell my TV, I'll sell my body, I'll sell whatever in order to get more. It's like the rewards are decreasing, but the amount of energy seeking the reward increases.
Mm.
And that's what we call negative reinforcement, because you're putting in all this energy to get a reward that you may or may not get, but that your brain remembers you did get originally. And the power of that is mind blowing. Like, I don't even have words for the power of that. And that again goes back to what we were saying earlier, that process addictions are not a character flaw. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It just means that you've engaged in the addictive process, which all of us do at some point, and you got hooked on it. And it's very, very hard to stop and to step away from something that is this powerfully reinforcing as dopamine is.
But it's possible.
It's possible.
It
And
is possible. Healing starts when we notice the urge to pick, pause or pick, pull, pause instead of perform the act of, and choose self-compassion. And we expand upon these concepts much more deeply in our treatment model, and unpacking these concepts using other, various words, that concepts that we'll bring into some of the courses we're going to be running. Understanding these concepts are what becomes the life-changing force, really, because naming it, noticing it, it's the first step. Awareness, we all know, is the first step. And then being able to slow everything down enough to get into some form of choice.
said. So shame frequently occurs after engaging in a process addiction. And clinically, shame is known to increase avoidance and stress, which then can intensify the urge to engage in the behavior of the process addiction. So it's that vicious cycle of, oh, I do this and I feel more shame, and then that's an uncomfortable feeling, and then I want to get away from that or soothe myself. So I'm going to engage in the behavior again. So it's a very, very tricky, slippery slope that most of it, very few of us, none of us really are conscious of when we first start engaging. It's just what happens again as a result of the neurochemistry. And so developing shame resilience is a key to recovery. And we're not going to go into what that entails today, but it is a teaser for something we have coming up. So developing shame resilience is the key to recovery from a body-focused process addiction.
Absolutely. And there's a whole formula for it to um to get to shame resilience, because shame resilience is real. As much as we can get addicted to the process of dopamine hits, we can also get addicted to, you know, this practice of building steps towards maintaining shame resilience.
Sure.
It is absolutely a real possibility and a real way to live. I feel like Karen and I can both speak to finally living our lives like that with
Absolutely.
that.
Absolutely. So just a little to ending today. Karen Pickett, which is me, compassionate therapist.
And me, master certified coach, and together we want to remind you that healing can be both meaningful and joyful. And yes, laughter is absolutely a part of the process.
We laugh a lot. And it's one of the things that also, not to get all chemical about it and stuff, but laughing actually also releases dopamine and other neurochemicals. And so, it's an antidote and a great way to practice living your life. Um, so let me just get back here. Okay.
So we want to open it up to questions. If Nico, if you have any questions,
Oh, definitely.
Beth, we are here for you.
More have a comment of thank you. This
Oh,
has been, I really like this way of looking at it because my whole standpoint of my recovery has been getting over the shame to figure out the what and the why of why I'm actually engaging. And I had a revelation this week of it's not actually the pulling, it's my arm being elevated when I'm doing the action is regulating my nervous system. So
Ah,
I think it's this, but I've been now my replacement behaviors if I elevate my arms because the vagus nerve and everything, it fulfills that same need for me. So this is giving me this language that's beautiful because so much of it is so behavioral based. I'm like, no, I actually love the addiction model. It's so good. But my mom has been also viewing her skin picking now as more of an addiction, and it's helping her feel so much less shame because she's like, wait, addiction runs in my entire family. And
ah.
so I'm so grateful to have this and just want to learn all that there is. And one last thought before moving on is I work with a lot of people with ADHD and autism, and I also have both of those things myself. And there's a very high co-occurrence rate of, you know, body focus process addictions and addiction in general. So I think this, focus on the dopamine part is really important because
mm,
especially with ADHD, there's that consistent need for
right.
dopamine. So
Mm.
this is just I'm so excited for where this goes and to learn more and just thank you.
Oh my gosh, I so appreciate hearing that and that correlation that you just made.
Yes. And for being able to, for your own benefit to sort of unpack the habit chain and realize that it's just raising your arms as opposed to, I mean, that's amazing, Nico, and
It's
I really
amazing.
appreciate you sharing that and everything that you shared, and I'm glad your mom is being helped as well by looking at this as an addiction. And absolutely there are generational patterns of addiction that can play out as body focused process addictions as opposed to alcoholism or drug use or whatever, so the whole addiction neurochemistry and predisposition, I think is a very important part to look at, and thank you for bringing that up, and thank
And